Hello there, Universals fans. Nick here, and welcome to this ranking of the War Doctor Big Finish audio box sets 1 through to 8. That's the original 4 John Hurt ones, and the first 4 Begins featuring Jonathan Harley ones. Now, at the end of December 2022, the War Doctor Begins series was confirmed to be getting a 5th and 6th box sets, due for release in May and December of this year. So this ranking will be out of date once those 2 stories come out. But like I said at the start of the He Who Fights with Monsters review, I'm going to do this ranking now anyway because I promised it. And if I don't do it now, then I will do it after the 6th box set comes out. Firstly, I might never actually do it. And secondly, even if I did, it's possible there could be even more box sets released after that. Who knows? They might go for a 7th and 8th next year. So I'm going to do the ranking for the first 8 box sets now as planned and as promised. And then we'll update it to include Begins 5, Comrades in Arms, and 6, Enemy Mine. So let us begin the War Doctor audio box sets 1 to 8 story rankings. Hello everyone, Nick here, and welcome to my ranking of the War Doctor audios 1 to 4 and the War Doctor Begins audios 1 through 4, as mentioned in the preamble / sketch prior to the titles. So, this ranking will be handled in 2 ways. First of all, I'm going to rank all 24 stories from the first 8 War Doctor box sets, the 4 with John Hurt, and the first 4 Begins box sets with Jonathan Harley, as previously mentioned. And then after that, I'm going to rank the 8 box sets themselves up against each other. So we're going to be doing 24 individual stories first, and then we're going to be doing the 8 box sets as wholes afterwards, ranking all of those together. Before we get into the list properly, here are the episodes we will be ranking. So from Only the Monstrous, the first box set, we have The Innocent, The Thousand Worlds, and The Heart of the Battle. From box set 2, Infernal Devices, we have Legion of the Lost, A Thing of Guile, and The Neverwen. From box set 3, Agents of Chaos, we have The Shadow Vortex, The Eternity Cage, and Eye of Harmony. From box set 4, Casualties of War, we have Pretty Lies, The Lady of Obsidian, and The Enigma Dimension. From Begins box set 1, Forged in Fire, we have Light the Flame, Lionhearts, and The Shadow Squad. And yeah, with these ones, it's just going to be the one big case as opposed to the individual stories ones. From Begins box set 2, Warbringer, we have Consequences, Destroyer, and Saviour. From Begins box set 3, Battlegrounds, we have The Keeper of Light, Temesis, and Rewind. And from Begins box set 4, He Who Fights with Monsters, we have The Mission, The Abyss, and The Horror. So, without any further ado, let us begin with the episode ranking, starting off with number 24 from Infernal Devices. We have Legion of the Lost, the first story in that box set. Now, if you want my full thoughts and opinions of each episode, do check out the 8 reviews of the box sets for further thoughts and opinions on each story. The basic gist of Legion of the Lost is that I'm not really a huge fan of this story. I'm not really fond of the story itself, and I just think it's the weakest War Doctor story to date. David Warner's great though. Love David Warner. Number 23 is the 3rd and final story from the 3rd box set, Agents of Chaos, Eye of Harmony, a disappointing season finale. Now, the previous 2 seasons, as well as the following box sets, had some pretty great finales. The Heart of the Battle and The Neverwen were pretty epic battle story finales for the first 2 box sets. The Enigma Dimension was a pretty interesting closure to the first run of box sets. And whilst Rewind isn't the greatest story, it was a pretty interesting concept and idea. And let's not forget how brilliant the Shadow Squad, Saviour, and The Horror are. So compared to the other 7 series finales, whether that's really great war stories or interesting story ideas or the closure of major story arcs, Eye of Harmony is a bit of a disappointment, as there really isn't that much going for it. The most interesting stuff is with Cardinal Ilistria and Helena, who, spoiler alert for this box set, who is revealed to be a double agent and traitor in the Eternity Cage, towards the end of the Eternity Cage. And the story's kind of focused on those two, but the rest of it isn't that interesting. That's really the most interesting stuff, is between those two, and why Helena has double-crossed the Time Lords and joined the Daleks, and now kidnapped Chancellor Ilistria. But the rest of the story just doesn't feel that great. I'm glad they kept the character introduced in Eternity Cage, the fun kid one. Kalan, I believe his name was, according to the cast list. But besides that, the story just isn't that interesting. There isn't really much going for it. And ultimately, it just ends up being a bit of a disappointing climax to an otherwise great series of adventures. Initially, Agents of Chaos was my favourite series of the original 4 box sets of Run, before I re-listened to Casualties of War, and that became my favourite. And had this finale been better, this one could have stayed back in competition. But as it is, this is a bit of a disappointing finale to an otherwise brilliant series of audio stories. Things get a bit more positive as we enter the first story from the Begins range to be on this list, with number 22, the second story of Battlegrounds, Temesis. Okay, this one isn't as disappointing as the two before, or as uninteresting, but I personally just couldn't quite get into this one as much as the other 21 stories that are coming up later on this list. But I was able to get into it more than the previous two. I just don't know, I wasn't so hot on this story either time I listened to it. It just didn't feel so great. The second half is definitely stronger than the first, but I don't know, it just feels like there's a bit of a back and forth here and there, and I'm not so on board with some of the ideas, and the power play stuff here doesn't quite work. I think it's better in He Who Fights with Monsters because it's not the focus of one side of the story, but because they are focusing on a random power play. I think if it wasn't a random Dalek leader who was being captured, who was the one who got contact with the files and was being captured. If it was like a Supreme, or the blue coloured Supreme 2008 Dalek design one from the 8th Doctor box, Dark Eyes box sets and so forth. Yeah, the blue version of the Dalek Time Strategist, which is purple. If it was kind of more of a power play between more high-profile Daleks, then it probably make more sense, because it's a random soldier leader sort of commander Dalek versus the Time Strategist. I don't really care, and most of the time it's being tortured anyway, so it's not really that interesting on that side. And then the file stuff, it's kind of like a bit of a hot and cold stuff, mostly cold, because I'm not feeling this until later on down the line. Yeah, it's a bit of a mixed bag on this one. It's definitely better structured than the previous two, and I just love the Doctor basically saying, oh, Commodore Tamazan, you have to do this, that, and whatever, or I won't do this thing for you, and otherwise it's going to blow up in our faces and whatnot. I really liked that the Doctor's basically just putting Tamazan in her place for once, like he did with Ilistria now and again. It just feels so satisfying every once in a while when either one of those two, Ilistria or Tamazan, get a bit bitchy. And the same also applies for the 8th Doctor and the Time War series he has. When they put them in their place, it always feels satisfying. But other than a few good moments in this story, I just wasn't so on board with it. None of these first three are bad stories. It's just that I'm not quite on board with them as the rest. However, this is easily the better of these lower 3 ranking stories. We jump up in quality for the second story of the first box set, of The Thousand Worlds, which comes in at number 21 on this list. Now, again, the reason this one is so low down is because of the villains. It's just another bunch of angry, grumpy, Nazi-esque dudes who sound like they might be from the north of England, which is nothing against the north of England, by the way. People from the north of England be just as bad if it was from the south or from elsewhere. But, you know, it's the characters that are really the main problem in this story. It's the villains are just angry, grumpy dudes who sound like they're from the north of England. But like I said, it would be just as weak if they were from other parts of England or the rest of the UK or internationally. It's just they're really boring characters. The whoever's in the null zone with the people the Doctor made friends with in the story before, and they have teamed up with the Daleks. They're just not that interesting characters, and I think that's what really knocks this one down. It's a pretty good, tense story, but what really knocks it down are those angry, grumpy dudes who are basically the allies of the Daleks in this story, and are the ones who fight against the people of Kalan and whatnot. They're just boring villains. The Daleks are on their own would have been fine, or maybe Daleks with some servants and stuff, but yeah, but besides that, this is a pretty damn good story, although I think the episode that follows it is a lot stronger. Sticking with second stories in a box set, that's 3 in a row now, we have A Thing of Guile from the second box set, and again, this one is a bit of a stronger story to the one that came before it, but because of the whole War Doctor becoming a war criminal thing that was introduced at the very end of Legion of the Lost, and it's just I guess that's cemented my distaste of that episode, or an episode I was already not really enjoying, and it kind of cemented that is the beginning of the absolutely terrible idea of making the War Doctor a war criminal, at least prior to when he's trying to do the moment stuff with the moments. It is an absolute terrible idea. And I don't know why Big Finish decided to do this. It's not interesting, and it doesn't work. Maybe if it was the Master and Derek Jacobi's charm could make for some interesting conflicting stories, or if this was later in the War Doctor's life, like Engines of War, the book, basically kind of makes him a bit of an enemy of the Time Lords towards the end in the last bit, and then that's pretty much the setup for the stuff with the moment. But no, this is just off the bat of him saving everything in the previous box set. It's basically just because he didn't let them have this weapon thing, and it's But despite the terrible war criminal stuff, A Thing of Guile is otherwise a really good story. If it wasn't for that whole stupid war criminal stuff, this one would be a pretty strong one. But because they had that stupid story arc, it has to be this low down on the list at number 20. But it's still a really good story elsewhere. There's some fun stuff. There's this captain who kind of looks up to the Doctor, even though he's considered a war criminal in this series. But he still wants to be like the really great heroic captain while still looking out for his crew. Meanwhile, the Doctor is on a pretty cool mission with Alyssa and a couple of other dudes dudes and dudettes maybe, and trying to find this rogue scientific faction of Daleks with these abominable creatures. It's a really good story. It's just such a shame it's lumbered in such an awful story arc. And what's worse is this one's the one that focuses it on the most, because Legion of the Lost, as I mentioned, is just at the very end, and Neverwhen is kind of the consequences of right after this story, but it doesn't play as huge of a role as it does here. So and that's why Thing of Guile has to go this low down on the list, because it's lumbered with this stupid story arc that, if it didn't have, it'd be one of the best stories of the era, or at the very least a lot higher than it actually is. Back onto more positive stuff with number 19, with the very first War Doctor audio, The Innocents from the first box set. This is a pretty good introduction to the War Doctor series, even if it's a bit odd that the very first story Big Finish did with the War Doctor, he's basically on holiday. Pretty much, he's pretty much on holiday after saving some Time Lords. He then lands on the planet Kalan, I believe it is. Keska, not Kalan, Keska, and yeah, he basically just has a holiday for like most of the episode, and some of the other times are like, oh boo-hoo, the Doctor's dead, and then realise, oh hang on, he survived. Okay, can you come back now, Doctor? No. Okay, come back. Ah! Don't have a choice in the matter. Right, go and do this mission in the next episode. Okay, whatever. But yeah, and also starting up the storyline of the following 2 stories as well, as though that's where it takes, the planet Kessler is where it takes place. But yeah, it's quite odd that the very first story of the War Doctor era basically just sees him on holiday for the most of the runtime. Then again, if he fighting a time war would make one want to go on holiday now and again, but as the very first story, I don't know, maybe if it was the first story of box set 2 or 3, or the arc of 4, maybe, but this is the first story, so it is a bit of a odd choice. But that being said, it's still a pretty damn good episode. Very, very well done. Get stuff off to a good start. Number 18 sees us return to the Begins era with box set 3's Rewind, the finale of this one, a much better finale than Eye of Harmony, its John Hurt's series counterpart, as in that was the finale to that series run of Audio's 3rd box set, and this is the finale to the 3rd box set of this run of Audio's originals and Begins. But yeah, Rewind is a pretty interesting story. It's got some good things going for it. I didn't quite get into it as much on my first viewing as I did later on, but I thought this was, or I say viewing, listen, but I did think this was a pretty damn good idea, handled pretty well in the story, and it was quite an enjoyable listen. The main character, Ignis Abel, main character of this story besides the Doctor, is a pretty likeable and fun character as we follow her, as well as a few other characters throughout this story, and it's a bit of it's a fun adventure. I don't think it's entirely perfect, but I do think a few re-listens are helpful to appreciate this story a bit more and what it's trying to do. I definitely think the ideas behind it are pretty damn interesting. Now, number 19 saw us at the very beginning of the original run of War Doctor Audios with John Hurt's Doctor. Now we start off Jonathan Carley's run with his very first episode, Forged in Fire's opening story, Lights the Flame, which is technically the post-regeneration story for the War Doctor, like how Brink of Destruction for the 6th Doctor, The Last Adventure, is technically his proper regeneration story. Light the Flame is a pretty interesting opener, seeing the War Doctor and the Sisterhood of Khan getting to grips with stuff, and how he plans to enter the Time War, aided by a lovely member of the Sisterhood of Khan, who's built up to be like, oh, she's going to be a great member and may possibly a great leader later down the line, before she's murdered by a rogue Time Lord who's trying to snatch some of the stuff from Khan, the flame itself, for the Time Lord's purposes in the war, much to the chagrin of the Doctor and Cardinal Rasmus, who returned, played by Chris Jarman from the 8th Doctor Time War 4. So there's a bit of nice continuity between 8th Doctor Time War and the War Doctor Begins, which is lovely. Especially since, at time recording, 8th Doctor Time War 5 has recently been released. I'm going to be listening to that soon. I'm going to start listening to that in a few days' time at time recording. By this point in the video coming out, I should have listened to it already. But when Begins started out, there was only 4 box sets of 8th Doctor Time War. They were finished by that point, so it's good to hear that a character from there, who apparently appeared before, but in this incarnation appears in that series, and now he's kind of like the bridge between these 2 series in the audios, along with Tamazan, who's now become a Commodore and has taken Alistra's role as the main boss of the Doctor's, or older Lady Time Lord boss for the War Doctor, as well as, I suppose, the 8th Doctor in Time War 3 and 4. And I made a mistake in my review of Casualties of War, where I said Jacqueline Pearce only had a few more stories in Time War 1, and that was her last stories. Actually, she has 1, I think, maybe 2, no, just 1 final appearance in the last story of Time War 2, so I'd like to apologise for my mistake there, and saying that after Casualties of War, she did 4 more stories for the 8th Doctor over 2 box sets. She also appears in one of the 2 8th Doctor Classic Doctors New Monsters audios that are also set in the Time War, the one in box set 2 to be precise. Back to Light the Flame. This one's a pretty interesting story, pretty fun, pretty good, and yeah, like The Innocents, kicks off this series of War Doctor audios in a really good way. Speaking of Cardinal Illustra and the original run of War Doctor stories, we have the strongest episode from the first box set. The Heart of the Battle, which is the third and final story of Only the Monstrous, takes the number 16 spot, as it is a pretty epic finale. Despite some weak supporting villains, as previously mentioned, it is a pretty damn epic and quite, in places, dramatic story. Much like the other one did, but I don't think the focus on the supporting villains harms this one quite as much. In fact, I think this one is definitely a more updated and refined script and a more stronger storyline to focus our finale of the first box set. It wraps the events up from the course of the whole trilogy up really nicely and gives us a bit of a bittersweet but still slightly hopeful ending, as well as more teasers of more War Doctor stories to come. It's a pretty damn good finale. It's not the strongest one, as we'll see later. We've got quite a few more finales coming up. I think we've only had 2 before this one, so we've got a couple more finales left. But this is definitely a good one to end the first box set on. Speaking of more good finales, we have the Neverwhen, the third and final story from the second box set, and this one basically saves box set 2, Infernal Devices, coming in here at number 15. The reason I say it saves it is because this one is still a really good story, in spite of the shit Dr. War Criminal stuff they did. A Thing of Guile kind of suffered for it, even though it would have been an otherwise great story. That one would definitely come a lot higher on the list without it, like I mentioned. This one doesn't have it focused as much, so it's a bit stronger, and the story surrounding it is really good as well. I think it probably would be even higher if it wasn't for that shit story arc, because just like A Thing of Dark Guile, they'd both be up a lot higher. But Neverwhen is still a pretty interesting story with some interesting concepts, interesting ideas, and some fun, enjoyable moments. It's a bit of an epic storyline, like Thousand Worlds, but with a bit of a sci-fi twist that they started playing with Infernal Dimensions, and will go on to do in not just further War Doctors box sets, but further Time War box sets as a whole. Whilst, okay, there was a bit of that in the first one, but that was definitely a very beginning one and first one into the foray of the Time War. And so that one felt like it was kind of quite mostly fights and battle stuff with a blocked off area where they had to get in. This box set felt like they had to add in a bit more sciencey stuff to make it like it's a time war, not just a war. So that's one strength the Infernal Devices box set has above Only the Monstrous. And the Neverwhen is a good, solid finale to that otherwise disappointing box set. We got a bit of a theme going, as my number 14 choice is the last of the John Hurt finales, being the Enigma Dimension, which is the first story on this list to be from the 4th box set. This is a pretty good finale. It is the weakest story of the final box set, but it's still a really good capper to John Hurt's run as the War Doctor on Big Finish. There's some good sciencey stuff going there. The inclusion of Leela, previously returning in the previous episode, as well as Illustra wrapping up her time as the Doctor's companion over the course of this particular series. Box set. It works really well, and there's some pretty interesting ideas. I don't quite follow it as well as some of the other stories. It is a little complicated, convoluted, but it's still handled really well, and there's a bit of a bittersweet feel to it, as it is the last one with John Hurt, and until Begins started up, the last War Doctor story in audio, full stop. And yeah, it's definitely a very good finale to that run. It's not the greatest finale, and it's not even the greatest story in that box set, but it's definitely a very nice wrap up to that era. Currently, at time of recording, it is the latest story chronologically for the War Doctor on audio, but that may change later down the line depending what they want to do. But I think they're focusing on War Doctor Begins at the moment, so yeah, it's mostly stories earlier in his timeline until later on. The comics might decide to do something with this maybe, or another book, but in the meantime, this is where the chronological order of audios comes to a close. There were plans to make a 5th box set with John Hurt, as I mentioned in the Who Fights with Monsters review, as it would have seen Ken Bones' The General return, but sadly due to John Hurt's passing that was not possible, and I don't know if those scripts were ever saved for Begins, transferred to the Eighth Doctor for his run of stories, or have just been left in the Big Finish writing script ideas cupboard. Number 13, from the very beginning of box set 3, the Shadow Vortex decides to play things a little differently. It decides to take the Time War to Earth, which until this point is pretty much been a no-go, as Earth was never part of the Time War and was always sealed off in a time lock. However, a Dalek agent called Lara, played by Niamh McIntosh, who usually voices / plays Madame Vastra, has snuck through and is basically causing havoc in 1960s Berlin. 1961 to be precise. Not sure if the wall was up by this point, but certainly they were divided. And the Doctor is chasing her, and they get caught up in the Cold War conflict on Earth whilst doing their own conflict. So it's kind of like a tale of two wars, but through the perspective of enemy agents, espionage, and so forth. It's a clever and interesting story. There's a lot of fun moments going for it, and Niamh McIntosh plays a really dastardly yet determined villainess in this story, and it's just nice to shake things up, take the Time War to Earth, as I mentioned. Infernal Devices added more of the sciencey elements to this science fiction war, as opposed to just being a science fiction war. And now box set 3 is adding even more ideas by taking characters to a place they're not supposed to go, in this case Earth. And then the next story, in the Eternity Cage, they introduced the Sontarans into the Time War. This is all really clever and fun ideas, and I'm glad that they worked out really well. Number 12, back to the Begins with the second story in this first box set, Fortune Fire. We have Lionhearts, which sees the return of the Furrows, I believe they are. I'm not quite sure. Now, I'm not a fan of Warriors Gate, the TV episode, at all. It's one of my least favourite stories of the entire show. Sorry, Will, I know you love this story. But this is definitely a strong sequel to that story. Although how they got from E-Space to N-Space, I do not know. Maybe Romana helps to get from E-Space to N-Space, and by the time she became president, they were just spread out across the universe. That or the Time War has seemed to have punctured universes, which I would not be surprised about. Anyway, so this is a pretty fun story. So we're trying to find the Farrell, who was the main ally in Warriors Gate, now played by John Dornery in this episode. They're trying to find him. His sister teams up with the War Doctor and another Time Lord soldier who kind of gets put on this mission by Tamazan, and they just go for a little bit of adventure and try to make sure the Thralls aren't killed by the Daleks. And yeah, it's a fun, enjoyable episode featuring these characters. There's some good interactions and some good moments, and also some pretty good ideas at the end and a bit of a twist here and there. And yeah, Birok, that's the character from Warriors Gate who comes back here and is played by John Dolney. And he's much better here. He's much better written in this story than Warriors Gate. This is a much better episode to that. And yeah, Lionheart's a pretty damn good fun adventure. And yeah, and the best thing is it's a great sequel to a story I despise. The second story from Casualties of War is next up as our number 11. The Lady of Obsidian reintroduces Leela. After supposedly going missing, the War Doctor soon finds the trace to a missing Leela and soon attempts to try and rescue her, whilst these kind of strange creatures who you saw on the cover are coming after her and the people she's protecting, whilst Cardinal Alistria is trying to get some allies on their side to fight against the Daleks, as well as these weird creatures. And it's another really strong story here. Some good moments between the Doctor and Leela, and Alistria trying to convince everybody to try and help her, and then getting back in contact with her people. She's definitely being more of a more active character in both this box set and Agents of Chaos than she is in some of the other ones. Definitely putting Jacqueline Pearce's acting chops to great use in all of her appearances, but this one especially manages to play with the character a lot more interestingly than some of the other stories do. The Lady of Obsidian is a pretty damn good middle story for the final box set of the John Hurt era of War Doctor stories, and the best box set of the initial 4 box sets run. Subscribe for part 2 of this ranking and for other Universals videos that you may enjoy.